Alright, welcome to another video from Lizard Landscapes. What I have here is a miniature, small tabletop waterfall for the beginner. So this is much more simplistic. I did a tall waterfall in 2013, which this is kind of based on, so check that out. But this is very small, almost kind of fits in the palm of your hand, not quite that small. But a lot less materials, a lot less time to create this. It's really meant for tabletop only, although you could really kind of alter this structure or build with a water pump that's got a filtration system on it. But this just has a water pump with a tubing system that goes up and fills a little reservoir, and then it kind of cascades down. So here you can see kind of the mechanics of how this works, where you've got that little reservoir that the tube from the water pump in its little area there will flow up and into that, then obviously flow from that little tiny reservoir into the main pond of the waterfall. So this was definitely an easier build than some of the waterfalls I've done in the past, and obviously with less materials and it being smaller, did not take as much time to do. Of course, another thing you can do is add a fogging system, which will just enhance the look of the waterfall. But be sure and check out the tabletop waterfall, as well as the second channel and third channel. So there you have it. Let's get started. So I'm near an open window, and got the table and all the supplies near an open window because I'm going to be using a couple of hot wires from the hot wire foam factory. So I've got a more like a knife tool and then a flexible cutting tool. And you want to have some sort of protection from the dust and the fumes. And lately I've been using that blue mask that's quite a bit more, I guess, professional in protecting you from that stuff. And here is just a very simplistic way of thinking about this project. I've got a reservoir, I've got it full of water. The water pump is immersed in it, and it flows up that tube and down into a pond that you would supply. So here I've got the water pump, and I'm just going to try to trace around what I believe to be the shape that I want of the pond and of the section where the actual pump is going to sit. So I've got the wire turned off at the moment, trying to shape it into the shape I want to try to cut out this shape using that thicker polystyrene. So continuing to cut out the pond area. This just takes a little bit of time. You can also do this in a different way where you create all these little rectangles and kind of build it up like a swimming pool. I'm going to cut off that extra piece there. And what I did was cut right through the bottom because I kind of determined as I was going along that I needed to have the water pump kind of sit down lower than what the bottom of the pond was going to be. I just needed more space, so I ended up kind of changing this a little bit. You can see how it's sitting, but I wanted it to sit even lower down so that essentially it was a water line issue where I wanted the water line to be have more of a healthy clearance above the water pump. So I've got a little shorter or thinner piece of polystyrene that will kind of be the base. So drawing out what I believe to be what I'm going to do with the landscape. I say that because essentially all these projects are kind of improvised. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of a sketch beforehand, but you'll see me oftentimes changing my mind and switching things up. one of the methods you can use is just using your fingers to kind of pick apart at the landscape, trying to give more of a random, rock look. So here I've got that, and what I'm going to try to do is trace around this, because I need a base for that, seeing as how I cut right through the piece where the water pump sits. And I ended up doing this twice, so you'll see another piece in the future, just so that that water pump can sit down in there even deeper. I'm going to glue that together, and I've got a sort of separating piece here where I've got to have the water flow over something. So this is kind of the beginning of that idea, and gluing that into place, kind of realizing I didn't make it tall enough, and so you'll see me change that later, but drawing out where I think the water is going to be directed. Here's a way of just using that flat hot wire knife of kind of going in between, creating these thinner pieces. So these pieces are meant for that little reservoir that catches the water from the tube. So this will be towards the top here, and that's where the water will build up and then flow over into the pond. So I'm going to create these ridges, or these little sides, that will essentially hold the water. And of course realized this was not going to be tall enough with what I wanted to do. Here's that correction I was talking of, trying to make this taller. So I really knew I needed more space between that, the base of the little reservoir, and the water pump. So here, kind of gluing this together, looks like a basketball hoop or something. So in the attempts of creating this covering, I'm going to use a piece that is relatively that tall and go around the structure. So here's where I cut again another hole, just to have that water pump be able to sit even further or deeper down. And just, you can do this, several times, just to be able to switch things up and make some corrections and give that. You can notice how much space I've got. You don't know that this water pump is going to last for a long time, and maybe the water pump they have available 2 years from now is going to be a lot bigger. So you can kind of plan ahead and make something a little bit bigger, just in case the water pump that's available that's comparable to this one is a little bit bigger. So cutting out a little hole for that tubing to go through just kind of gives it an area to go through and holds it in place. So that's where that tubing will go. I'm sure there's other ways of doing this, but this is just how I did it. And then creating or adding a little notch, and that just kind of essentially keeps the tube from flying up, gives it kind of a wedge in order to keep it in place. So here I've got some pieces where this will be that second piece that covers or camouflages the pump and the tubing system. And I've cut them out in a way that they can kind of wrap around and fit together a little bit better. So there, that is how the second piece is going. I've got a little section cut out for the cord to go. So you want to be mindful of whatever you're going to have in that. If you're going to have, obviously you have to have the water pump, but if you're going to have the fogging system as well, because it's got a cord. So that is how that is looking. And I want to create a top to that. So a really easy way of doing that is just set it on another piece of polystyrene and just trace around it. So you've got the exact shape you need. and that will be end up being the top of that covering. Be sure and check out the materials list video, which goes over all of the materials I'm using. So here is a little piece, just random piece that I'm going to try to make look like rock. I'm going to glue that into place, and then I've got another random, probably just leftover pieces. I'm going to glue that into place to try to create that, I guess, finishing touch to the covering. To try to create this kind of crude covering, and then you glue, or I glued other pieces of polystyrene on it in order to make it look more realistic. So here I've sped up the video, obviously, and it's another way, or a way, of creating kind of rock face, which is just an easy way of fleshing out, just so it doesn't look flat, the rest of your project. It gives it a little bit of texture and kind of like rock paneling, and you can get in there later and try to have it look more realistic by creating divots and gouges and whatnot. But so here, there is where I'm going to have the water flow out of. So I've got this little piece to encourage sort of an arc to the look of the water. And like I say, with doing that method where you can create the look of rock, and it's kind of like using rock paneling. But another way, as I've mentioned, is just kind of picking at it to try to create this sort of random look of rocks. You can just use your fingers and a knife, or if you do have a hot wire, you can move this wire back and forth to try to create different organic looks to the project. Another thing you can do is just take other pieces or separate from the sculpt. Instead of taking away, you can add pieces in order to create a more sort of uneven rock type look. And with every project, you'll end up having these gaps or holes or crevices that you really want to try to fill in before you move on to the mortar stage. And you can do this with little tiny pieces of polystyrene and glue, or you can just use glue and use up some of your glue by filling in those little gaps or holes that will inevitably be created. So there is how the finished polystyrene sculpt is looking. And now please listen to this short intermission. Alright, intermission time. I shared this a couple of times before in other videos, going completely off topic. But I feel since some of these videos can get a lot of views, I think it's a great opportunity to share the most important thing one can ever learn in this life. And that is, salvation comes through one individual, Jesus Christ. I say this because I didn't know this until I was around 34. Everyone should have the chance of hearing this. Whether there is fertile ground out there or not with those listening is something I don't know, but I feel compelled to do it, in part because I would have wanted it done for me. Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be, the Son of God, who is essentially offering you a free gift of eternal life. He paid for all of our punishment on the cross, so that we wouldn't have to pay for our own wrongdoings in eternity. This doesn't give you a license to do wrong. He asks you to repent or turn from your wrong actions and follow him. I think a lot of people believe, as I used to believe, in that your good is going to outweigh your bad. The problem is that wouldn't hold up in court, even with our standards, let alone God's. If you were in court for a specific crime, but you told the judge about all the good you've done in your past, should that affect his decision about the crime you're currently in court for? Of course it wouldn't. The bottom line is there is no other way apart from a Savior. Trust in Jesus' work on the cross as being the only way the ultimate judge can grant you salvation and eternal life. Thanks for listening. All right, thanks for listening to that. Now is the stage of adding a mortar. So I've got foam coat, which is also from the hot wire foam factory. I've used non-sanded and sanded grout in the past, just regular tile grout. But this stuff is really much better, and having used both, I can certainly tell the difference. This is, designed to be applied to EPS polystyrene. So, it clings, it doesn't flake off, it doesn't crack as grout will. So it's a much better product or decision if you're serious about creating one of these. And what you can do, because this project is so small, you can just hold it over, the bowl, and all the excess will just fall back into the bowl, sort of ensuring you don't waste any product because it can get quite drippy. So because this is not meant for an animal, this is just a tabletop waterfall, I'm just going to apply one really good coat of this foam coat. Just really work it into all of the crevices, and this will do a couple of things. It'll strengthen your project, plus it'll create a much more natural rock look. And here what I'm doing is, once it's all covered, I'm going to apply another layer of just adding a texture. So I've got this kind of old brush and doing kind of a stippling method where using the foam coat, in combination with the bristles of the brush, can really create a good texture of all these, thousands of little tiny crevices and bumps that will come in handy in the painting process. So here's an optional stage where this is another product from the Hot Wire Foam Factory called Bounce, and it will strengthen the project. It'll give the project a little bit of give, just like its name suggests. It'll give a little bit of bounce to the project, so enhances the durability and just general strength of the project. So I'm going to start the painting stage, and just like with the winter waterfall, I'm going to try to do a series of washes. So I had really never done a kind of brown beige sandstone rock look. Did a red sandstone rock look, so I'm going to try to do this beige kind of faded brown look. And really the process here is doing a wash where you mix up a certain color of acrylic, and then you add quite a bit of water to, in this case, a little old tub of cottage cheese, and with the goal of trying to cover in random ways the project, knowing that I'm going to go back over it and cover it with another shade of this color. So I'm not too concerned with doing a great job in covering this, knowing that I'm going to just go back over it with a different shade and just sort of add. In this case, I'm using kind of a darker brown for the second layer. So I've let that first layer dry and kind of going back over this, and just randomly, with the goal of not covering everything, kind of leaving some parts or spaces that you don't cover. And here using obviously kind of a really dark brown, if not black, and then going back in with a clean wet brush and kind of getting rid of 80 to 90% of what you just applied, but that last 10% that stays behind can really apply or I guess introduce a much more interesting blend of colors. So using the clean wet brush here and kind of getting rid of some of those streaks and the areas you don't like. But some of that color, like here, you can really see it'll pool up and it'll get into those crevices that maybe you applied that texture with, and you can get into some interesting, much more realistic, natural looking rock. And then going back in and using a layer of not as thin sort of highlight color. So there's not as much water here, and this is a really light beige. And you can go back in with a clean wet brush and kind of erase some of that so you can see some of the other layer. And just really it's a process of just adding layer after layer until you're finally happy with it. So going in between the cracks here can really make some of those rocks kind of pop out if they've got sort of this illusion of a shadow, and really create some interesting depth. So here, going back in with that darker color and just trying to create the illusion of some cracks, and then going in with, that's a clean wet brush, and essentially kind of erasing 80% of it, as I've said, and what's left behind is just a much more realistic look of a crack in the rock. So here, doing same thing, where I'm just kind of adding some darker color, and then couldn't quite get away from the dry brush technique as I've used in the past, where you load your brush up full of paint, in this case like a highlight color, and then remove it on a paper towel. And then the paint that is left behind, the texture will kind of pull off a little bit, here and there. And then using a really light beige as a highlight color, applying here and there, and with the goal of just adding a little bit to accent some of that other color that's of a different color. So here, applying sort of a blue-green, so it's an aqua color to the pond, and just getting in where, making a guess as to where the water line is going to be. Sometimes you can really tell, sometimes it's a little bit, of a guess. So trying to create that edge of where the water line is going to be, and then going back in with a clean wet brush and kind of blending that line so that it's not so harsh and fake looking. So with the attempts of trying to create this with a more natural look, going in with that clean wet brush and kind of blending away those harsh edges that you rarely see in nature. So here what I'm doing is I'm going to do a test, and I'm applying a water-resistant sealant to all the areas that are going to have water on it. And I applied this to everything, even that reservoir in the back and the top as well, that little tiny reservoir. And I let this sit for 72 hours. So let that get to a full water repellent state. Then add some water, and just to really make sure that there's no major structural problems or any huge leaks. So trying to make sure that it's actually going to work before I move on to another stage. And this is something you can do earlier, maybe before the painting stage. It would have been a better idea to do that. But just to make sure that, because if there is a problem, you're going to have to start dismantling or adding to, maybe try to make it work. Maybe that reservoir wasn't deep enough. You'd have to make it a little bit taller in certain areas. So it's always good to do a test. So once that test has been done, I'm applying that same sealant to all of the areas. So obviously getting it in where the water is going to be. But in addition to that, I'm going to be spraying this essentially everywhere to try to create that surface where this will really, even though this isn't for a living creature, this is, it'll extend the life and the durability of the waterfall to create this sort of tough exterior. So once that is done, I applied like 4 layers, and you want to have at least 72 hours in between each layer. I've got this outside, and it's outside because I'm going to be applying silicone. This is aquarium grade silicone. I'm going to apply this to all the areas where I'm going to have water on it all the time. So, and this is something where you want to give yourself 2 to 3 hours, depending on the size of your project. You don't want to be in a hurry. You want to be able to go over each section, a couple times as you're doing it. Make sure it's, a thorough covering, because all it takes is one little fraction of an inch where you haven't covered it, and that could potentially create a leak in the future. So going over all of the areas, even that little back area where the pump sits, and I'm going to have that sit out there on the balcony outside, anywhere outside, because you don't want this indoors because the fumes are so intense with aquarium grade silicone. So I'm going to let that sit out there for a week and let it air out, let it cure. and bring it back in, and another stage so that those two pieces that separate from each other don't stick together. I'm going to do this process where I've got some sealant and I'm going to apply it to all of the areas where those two pieces are going to come into contact with each other. So I've got that water-resistant sealant. I'm going to sprinkle sand on it so that when those two pieces go together, it'll basically be sand on sand contact, and it'll prevent them from sticking together, at least more so than if you just had sealant on sealant, which is very tacky and very sticky. Then I'm going to brush away the loose sand after that dries. And put the two pieces back together. Another thing you can do to enhance the look is just with that same sealant, apply it to certain areas, and then taking colored sand and applying it, and it'll just stick to the sealant. You can create a really tough surface with this, but really more for the look of creating more of a natural rock look. You can apply the sand to it. So there you have it, finished miniature tabletop waterfall for the beginner. So be sure and check out the other waterfalls, especially the original tall tabletop waterfall that goes into quite a bit more depth. But be sure and check out the second and third channels. And obviously you can incorporate a fogging machine for interesting look. And thanks for watching.